Thank you so much for being here. It's a real privilege for me to welcome you all to, I think, what CPR does best, a serious, deep, rigorous conversation that cuts through the noise, where CPR scholars engage and analyze some of the most important issues of our time. In fact, this is what makes CPR. So I'm very proud and excited that we've been able to put this conversation together on the future of India-China relations with CPR's best scholars. What we have for you today is a moderated conversation with Srinath Raghavan, sort of leading the conversation with Ambassador Saran and Zoravar. And the idea really is to go beyond the headlines that often lead us into a cacophony of noise in our news and in our public discourse, to really understand where we've come since last August in the evolving relationship with China. Look a little beyond India and at what's happening within the region more broadly, to try and understand how events within the region are shaping the future of India-China relations. And I think at some stage, of course, we will touch upon the question of the United States and US-China relations and what that means for us. I hope that this is the first of many such deep conversations that we have at CPR, where we hope to bring to you an engaged, rigorous conversation on what's happening within the world of foreign policy in a way that, that really engages with the issues and brings together a group of you to seriously discuss where the world is today. So thank you, and over to Srinath.
Thank you, Yamini, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. So as Yamini said, we really want to sort of start off from the end of the long standoff between Indian and Chinese troops in Doklam and look through the various kinds of issues that are intertwined and currently in the relationship. Ambassador Saran, maybe I could begin with you, sir, by asking you to just give us your assessment of what do you think were the sort of tacit sets of understandings on which the Doklam crisis was resolved, because this was the longest standoff which we had since the Samdurongchu incident in 1987, which took many years to resolve. The fact that it did not escalate into any kind of an armed conflict was obviously a good thing, but clearly there were a series of understandings which enabled the mutual withdrawal to happen. And the reason I'm asking this question is because one of the things which has been in the news in the months since are stories about sort of a Chinese build-up in that area. They're doubling down in terms of the infrastructure. And what I want to understand is whether any of those activities constitutes a departure from what was understood at that point of time. Are we seeing a renewed bout of Chinese activism, or is it that they just want to sort of do things in order to strengthen their existing positions?
Thank you, Srinath. My own understanding of what happened when the so-called understanding was reached was that it was, in fact, a very limited understanding. Limited to the extent that both sides agreed that they will, in fact, continue with the status quo, meaning thereby that the advance of the Chinese construction teams working on the road, they would not go beyond where they had already reached. So it was, in that sense, a very limited understanding. I do not think that there were other sort of understanding with respect to where do we go from here. I think it was just limited to the fact that we will just disengage. Neither side will move beyond where you already are. So in that limited sense, I think that status quo is maintained, but that has not prevented China from consolidating its position behind where they are right now, and that's fairly well documented now. We also see road construction activity taking place on the flanks of Doklam, which in a sense is changing the the security situation in the region. By the way, there is considerable activity, I believe, also taking place on the Indian side. You would have seen reports of our strengthening our deployments in and around that area. So bottom line is that yes, the status quo is holding, but that has not really prevented other activities from taking place around the area.
Robert, if I may just ask you to sort of walk us through a little bit more about the security implications of some of these things which are happening, right? Because at the time when the Doklam confrontation happened, the principal concern for India, apart from other wider issues, was about the sort of what this change in status quo would mean as far as Chinese sort of attempt to outflank the Chumbi Valley and go down to the Chicken's Neck area is concerned. Now, does this kind of hardening of infrastructure in some ways enable the Chinese to repeat these kinds of activities in the future, or is it just an attempt by China to assert that, listen, as far as the status quo is concerned, we are free to do what we want, and we are not seen as having caved in to that particular confrontation?
Sure. So one of the things I find interesting is we still have not arrived at a consensus on what motivated the Chinese to intervene in this crisis. Was it to, one argument is to wean away Bhutan from India, or to make that relationship somewhat more complicated? Was it to demonstrate to the Indian side that the Chinese can quite easily demonstrate that they can impact Indian security where it might hurt them? So we have to sort of come to what motivated. So I would actually step back and process this as a culmination or an expression of a much deeper escalation of this rivalry, which sort of exploded in Doklam. So Doklam was a symptom of something much deeper that was sort of spiraling over the last 2 years, where this competition from across issue areas, and finally it comes to an area where it can really hurt the Indian side. So, and the Indian reaction was naturally very, very cautious, because you are intervening to secure ostensibly the territorial rights of your neighbor, but also your own security. So you had this. The resolution shows that an optimist could argue that the basic consensus after 1988, that the modus vivendi, that we will not resort to force to pursue our territorial claims, that sort of still prevailed, and you did pull back. But this sort of tells you the fragility of the existing sort of arrangements that you were relying upon to maintain stability and security. So,
if I can just ask a follow-on question,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I take your point that there was a wider sets of issues on which India and China were rubbing up against each other. There is also a well-established pattern of sort of activity along the disputed line of actual control, with patrolling, with various kinds of infrastructure sort of construction activities on both sides. We've seen that happening in 2013 as well. But what happened in Doklam, wasn't it also a qualitatively different kind of an event from any of those? Because here the Chinese seem to have contravened a clearly written understanding, which was arrived as part of the special representatives process, that the tri-junctions would be resolved only after consultation with the third
With all three
countries in
parties,
question, right? And in this context, of course, the third country was Bhutan, which has been having its own set of dialogue. So it does seem to sort of not just mark a sort of a culmination, but also some kind of a qualitative difference in the way that the Chinese attempted something like this.
Sure. So you're right. From all the previous sort of standoffs or face-offs were on the line of actual control, which are purely the India-China frontier and disputed pockets. Here, it was a third-party area. So I think the Chinese side, if you argue that they truly wanted to send a signal, were showing to the Indians how easily that they can complicate India's security position and its overall sort of treaty relationship with its neighbor. So, but for me, the interesting question is, why did it reach that far, and how did you respond? And I think those are the areas to. And I thought the Indian response, one could argue, once, even though maybe I'm digressing slightly, if you look at what the Indian ambassador has recently in China, Mr. Bambawale has remarked in an interview, and if you read between the lines, I found it very interesting, where he, of course, names the Chinese very clearly in changing the status quo, but he's also sort of implying that the Indian response might have skipped a couple of levels by reaching for that military intervention. Was diplomacy, was that channel exercised? were those calls taken, or because from what I've understood from his comments is he's clearly showing that the Indian side perhaps uh, sort of reacted in a precipitate action. I don't know if maybe I'm exaggerating, but certainly he suggests that diplomacy was not pursued enough, which might have strengthened your moral case for that final intervention. But
Well,
that's,
I mean, but in the same interview,
yeah.
you also said that if something like this happens again by the Chinese side, then the Indian response is likely to be the same, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think in a sense there is a playbook now in place
Fair
of
enough.
certain kind.
Yeah.
Ambassador Saran, if I can sort of ask you a little bit more on this story. I mean, how do you think both sides? What were the lessons that both sides took away from Doklam? Because you know, in one of the articles that you had written immediately after the crisis was resolved, you said that from the Chinese side, the main sort of motivation for them to de-escalate the situation and the standoff was they wanted to ensure that Prime Minister Modi's trip to China, which was then going to happen at that point of time, would go forward, right? So in a sense, there was a larger political consideration which led them to do it. And I was just wondering what your assessment now is after a few months, whether you think that still was the main reason the Chinese were doing it, and what do you think were the lessons the Indians learned? Because I think that is now you know, suggesting some new kinds of policy initiatives which we'll pick up in a little bit. But what do you think both sides took away from that particular standoff?
It is true that you know there were various reasons why maybe China also decided to step back from an open confrontation or from an escalation. One was the fact that the 19th Party Congress was going to be taking place, and any such encounter has its uncertainties, you know, which could have impacted on the domestic political situation or whatever script Xi Jinping had with respect to the party congress. Secondly, as you mentioned, there was also the BRICS meeting going to take place, and certainly China is invested in it heavily. And if there was, as a result of this confrontation, a Indian Prime Minister not going for the BRICS summit, this would have impacted a larger sort of global diplomacy that China is engaged in. So these were important considerations, which may not, you know, be repeated again in the future. So we should be conscious of that. That there were certain particularities in this case, which, in a sense, were helpful to the Indian side in de-escalating the situation. This may not be the case later on. That is one aspect. Second aspect is, I think if you are doing a post-mortem of why this happened, my sense is that those who decided to do this did not regard this as a very serious intervention on their side. They must have thought of this as what I call a very low cost, low risk intervention, for the reason that it was not on the India-China LAC, number one. Secondly, I think the messaging that was directed was more to Bhutan rather than to India. Why? Because, as you know, several rounds of, I think 24 rounds of talks on the border have taken place. There is a certain offer from the Chinese side with regard to a package settlement of the border. Essentially, the Bhutanese response has been to string this along as much as they can, not delay really taking a decision. I think what has happened in the last couple of years is essentially China telling Bhutan, you know, this cannot be lying on the shelf all the time for you to decide when you want to, you know, take a decision. If you do not take a decision on this, then we should be free to assert our territorial claims as we deem fit. You know. So it's in a sense nudging Bhutan to take a call on this. Also, I think taking into account what is a new sentiment, popular sentiment in Bhutan, that why are we not going for a more balanced relationship of Bhutan with China and India? There may be benefits to Bhutan in terms of, say, infrastructure investment, in terms of trade, in terms of tourism. You know, we seem to be caught in a India-China, you know, battle. which is really not, we don't have a skin in the game. You know. So I think there was also a sense that there is a public opinion within Bhutan which may also be helpful in terms of getting China what it wants. Collaterally, of course, there would be a security benefit vis-a-vis India, yeah, certainly. But I think my sense is that it was not so much a message to India as it was what was thought of as a very low risk, low cost way of nudging Bhutan into taking a call on the relationship between China and Bhutan. And I think that was a miscalculation. They did not expect the kind of response which came. So for the Chinese side, there will certainly be a wariness about, perhaps future interventions of this kind. But there is a larger question here, which is that over the last several years, of course, a dramatic improvement in the border infrastructure on the Chinese side, but India has started catching up. We are still far behind. I mean, the asymmetry is still quite glaring. But there is no doubt that there has been considerable work on border infrastructure taking place on the Indian side as well. So it should come as no surprise that what used to be occasional encounters between the patrols of the two sides on the LSC, these encounters have become much more frequent. Because, if you are going to a particular location once in 3 weeks or 4 weeks because it is such a remote area, now you are virtually, you get into a jeep and you can drive up to the place virtually every day if you wish to. So I think what is also happening is that across the LSC, quite apart from what may be a policy decision to be more interventionist, there is also the capability to be more interventionist. And therefore, a lot more encounters have been taking place, which is not what was envisaged in the peace and tranquility agreement that we have in place between India and China. So there is in some sense a need to relook at that, how to now deal with what is a somewhat different situation at the LSC, where there will be greater frequency of these kind of encounters, and the SOPs that we have in place, which have served us very well over the last several years, maybe those SOPs need to be, strengthened in some way.
So you would say that in some ways the Doklam crisis at least put out a red flag saying existing mechanisms now need to be revisited, that we may be sort of running up against the limits of how much they can help control this kind of competition or competitive behavior along the LSC.
Yeah, I mean, we have already, in a sense, as a result of earlier, incidents like the Depsang incident, for example, or what happened in Chumar, we have now in place a sort of communication mechanism going right up to the CMC, that is the Central Military Affairs Commission. So we have, I mean, it's not that we have not kept up, but it's not as much as we require. The other aspect which perhaps is worthwhile noting, and this is something which has been a positive factor in India-China relations. When I look back at, say, the last 15, 20 years of India, managing India-China relations, a complex relationship, I'm struck by the fact that, the regular summits between the leaders of India and China, not only bilateral summits taking place in each other's capitals, but a willingness to meet at the sidelines of, regional meetings, the BRIC meeting, for example, G20 meeting, the United Nations General Assembly. No opportunity has been lost for the leaders of the two countries to engage with each other on a very regular basis. And my sense is that this has played a very important role in sort of stabilizing the relationship between the two countries, where even just the meeting between the leaders, even if there is no sort of concrete outcome, the messaging that goes down the systems on both sides is leaders want this relationship to remain calm and cool in that sense, which is what happened in the case of Doklam as well. Don't forget that the first, move towards de-escalating came as a result of a meeting between Xi Jinping and the Prime Minister at the Hamburg. where essentially the decision was, yeah, this is unfortunate, should not have happened. Should we not have diplomatic, channels made active again to deal with this? And the both leaders said yes. That is how those conversations took place in Beijing. As a result of which, by the time you come to BRICS, the issue has been managed, not resolved, but it has been managed. So going forward, again, a lesson that perhaps we need to take into account is that in what is a very rapidly changing relationship between the two countries and the geopolitical environment, it is very important that this tradition of regular summits between the leaders of the two countries, this remains intact. That is something which I consider very important.
And in some ways, maybe Zorawar, you could make a case that that may be the premise on which this current effort at arranging a series of meetings, starting with our foreign secretary's visit to Beijing, and this announcement that we're going to have a series of interactions. The Prime Minister is going back to China. There is some media reporting saying that the Indians are very keen to try and get senior Chinese leadership, perhaps the president himself, to come to India during this calendar year, and so on. So, do you think this attempt at stabilizing and creating these kind of forums for regular interaction is a knock-on effect of the Doklam crisis itself, or
Certainly,
is it also got to do with other broader issues that you were referring to earlier?
So certainly, I think the consensus after this crisis, when it was resolved, was, and I certainly experienced this. I was in Kunming actually for a conference just a month after the crisis was resolved, and you could sense from at least the major South Asia watchers within China that it was actually surprising to see that they did not expect this level of escalation to have happened, and actually for the first time they sensed the costs of a confrontation with India, regardless of its outcome at a tactical level, would have been quite severe for the Chinese, and that's the reason why they actually put back when they evaluated this crisis from the larger perspective of India-China relations, they did not find any advantage in a confrontation with India. So what does that tell us? It tells us that interdependence, as shallow as it is in the last 20, 25 years, was sufficient to at least have done that. And I think that's where Ambassador Saran is right, that let's not draw conclusions from the military side that your military deterrence had reached a level that, which is the argument that maybe some from the military, though frankly, if you speak to the Indian military privately, they would tell you that our position on the frontiers is in no position to do this kind of deterrence game. So now we are at that stage where I wouldn't say this is a radical shift in China policy. Maybe we're returning to the old normal that was actually tossed out by the government in favor of a more radical shift. What was the old modus vivendi? Modus vivendi was, we have our differences, we have our disputes, but we're also going to continue these common areas of cooperation in lots of overlapping interests. Where are those international institutions? It could be in the economy, it could be bilateral economic interdependence, it could be in environment, etc. So we are at that position where now you have these sort of two stools. You have these differences, and of course this semi-frozen territorial dispute, and then you have these whole range of issue areas where there's ambiguity, but there's also some clarity that you can work with the Chinese. Let's say AIIB, BRICS, etc., SCO. I mean, this is the first time you're going to have a leadership at SCO after your formal entry into the organization. So maybe in some sense we're returning to the old China policy, but as it's been suggested by some of our veteran China watchers, that is that enough, or should we be trying to seek some sort of a modus vivendi, even if it's, let's say, a temporary one? It might not be like the US-China normalization of the early 70s, which was based on a shared perception on global order, let's say, a common threat, or even the Sino-Soviet normalization after 86, and look at where it's transformed to today. So we have to actually ask ourselves that if you want that level of normalization, there are going to be adjustments required from the Indian side and of course from the Chinese side. There are going to be concessions, there are going to be give and take. This is regardless of the frontier. I think this relationship has gone beyond the problems we have on the border to lots of these other issue areas, and I don't think even the China debate in India or Delhi has even gone to that point to start debating what this level of a temporary truce thaw could be and how do you test it out, and how do you measure its success? So
So in effect, you'd say that, just like Ambassador Saran was talking about, saying your, say, border peace and tranquility mechanisms might be straining at their limits. You're suggesting that even the sort of political compact needs to be in some ways revisited and put through a fresh set of tests to see what works and doesn't work.
yeah, absolutely. So and one area where we will need to sort of look at how you can handle this China's rise as far as it pertains to your neighborhood is what's happening in the region. So the Chinese have very clearly staked out a policy where they are in South Asia, and they are saying they're going to continue that engagement in South Asia, both from the maritime side and from your land frontiers and these corridors that are coming down, and it's engaging with each of your neighbors. And we have not arrived at what your policy response is going to be. Is it going to be something, and what is your conception of regional order? That the old conception of regional order, we didn't have to deal with a lot of these issues because most of the external powers were coming in from fleeting moments in and out. Here you have a, which has always been a neighbor, frankly, from 1950, now truly saying that we're not only going to just be a neighbor, we're going to actually deepen our integration with a neighborhood that you have perceived as exclusively yours. So how do you craft that relationship, and how do you craft it at a time when your neighbors themselves want multi-directional engagement and a multi-vector foreign policy? In fact, they're behaving much like India behaved for most of the Cold War and still continues to behave. So how do you put yourself across, and how do you put those norms to deny them that relationship? Let's say it's happening in the economic development sphere. If you are inviting Chinese FDI into India, how can you ask the Sri Lankans or the Bangladeshis to stop that process? What you can do is maybe craft some set of common norms. And I think the Indian side, when it sort of voiced its dissent to the BRI, did put across that let there be sustainability, let there be a sense of competitive bidding process, let there be certain metrics that, yes, you engage in this pot of sort of economic infrastructure projects, but let there be some sort of transparency.
Yeah.
Now those have to be arrived at in a far more mutual, sustained process, because you can't sort of ram those norms down.
Sure.
And yeah.
So, Ambassador Saran, I mean, while much of the reporting in India seems to suggest that, it's the effort has been taken from the Indian side to sort of pick up the threads and normalize the relationship and so on. It does seem like the Chinese have also sort of indicated that they want to sort of, in a sense, put the Doklam issue and its shadow behind and move on in other ways. I mean, there was a statement by the state councillor which was quite a positive sounding one. And even the kind of language which is being used to talk about mutual aspirations, interests, etc., is kind of reminiscent of the joint statement which was given when Prime Minister Modi went in May 2015, which was a very forward-looking document about how India and China should, accommodate each other's aspirations on the global stage and so on. Do you think that the context is suitable for that sort of an attempt at this point of time?
Frankly, I don't.
Okay.
We have to recognize that there is no going back to the what seemed to be a certain consensus which was arrived at, say, in 2005.
Sure.
2005 consensus was very clear. The two leaders, leadership of the two countries said, today we are two of the largest emerging economies. What we do together is going to impact on the global situation. And if we as emerging countries are looking to adjusting, for example, existing regimes, or if we want to shape, new regimes like on climate change or, space or, maritime security, if we want to shape these new regimes, then India and China working together can make a very big difference. So there is a strategic, convergence between the two countries insofar as this larger global situation is concerned. Therefore, we should look at our bilateral relations, including the border issue, from that larger strategic perspective. We need to solve the border issue quickly so that we can get on with the bigger job, the bigger challenge that faces both countries. Okay, so that was very important. Second was, even if it was rhetorical, it was important because China does not look at India as a threat, and India does not look at China as a threat. Both are such large countries, ancient civilizations, that no containment of either country is possible. So we are in a different kind of a situation. In fact, further, because we are the two largest emerging economies, India is a opportunity for China, and similarly, China is an opportunity for India. And there is therefore enough space for both the ascendancy of China as well as India in the Asian region, as well as far as the world order is concerned. So this was a basic kind of a framework which was established at that time. And actually it worked in a sense. I mean, my own experience, for example, working with them on climate change. I mean, if you're looking at who were our best allies in the negotiations leading up to Copenhagen, it's the Chinese. Okay. There was also a sense in China that actually not just India, but this group of emerging countries could actually make a very big difference in terms of the global situation and would be helpful to China in its own aspirations. So it needs to work together with the other areas. And the culmination of that was what happened on the last day in Copenhagen, where you had the four, emerging countries. You had China, India, Brazil, South Africa sitting on one side of the table, negotiating with Obama sitting on the other side. So you look at the imagery. Now, if you want to see what has happened since then, the situation has dramatically changed, and you need to acknowledge that. Today, that consensus no longer holds. Why? Because China says, we are 5 times your size. We benchmark ourselves with the United States of America. We don't benchmark ourselves with, the emerging countries. We are not an emerging country. We are a number 2 economy in the world. So, what they are looking at, at least in terms of their aspirations, what they are looking at is that you have to acknowledge. Therefore, if you are looking at new consensus from the Chinese side, the new consensus must be that you acknowledge that we are at the top of the pile. You are not. You are in a second order. And if you do not accept that, problems will arise. So if it is NSG, in 2008 when I was in Vienna, the Chinese did not want to be the one country which puts up its hand and says, no, we don't agree to India getting the waiver. Fast forward to 2015, China says, we don't care. We will be the one, if it is, we are just the one country which opposes India's entry, we will. We don't care. So that is the trajectory that you have traveled in the last 10 years. And we have to remember that the situation is not just going back to the old consensus, not possible. Now, the challenge for you is, what is the relationship that is possible with China, given the asymmetry that exists and is likely to, in fact, become worse. It is this asymmetry which is causing the kind of challenges which we are facing. One, of course, what lesson you draw from that is, unless you develop your own capabilities, and you begin at least to address this asymmetry, your political position, your international status will keep diminishing. Your neighbors are looking at what is happening here. I mean, there is this change taking place. So they are reflecting in their reactions to you, they are reflecting that change. So this is why Malay says, take back your helicopter because I can get 10 from China. Okay. So we have to recognize this change. So one is, do we recognize the challenge and say, look, whether we like it or not, we have to begin addressing that asymmetry. There is no escape from that. Second is, what can I do in this period to try and link up with other countries who have similar concerns as we have, and try and see whether a degree of constraint on China, not containment, but constraint on China is possible. That is very, very, very important to be able to do that. My own experience is that if you have a strong, diversified set of relationships with other major powers, it helps in keeping China in a certain sense on the right track. More isolated you are, people say, oh, don't do things to provoke China. But if you are actually going to get into that kind of position of isolation where you are hesitant to link up with other countries because of fear of provoking China, you will end up in a worse situation. I mean, that's my judgment. So, one, no going back to the old consensus because it doesn't exist anymore. Secondly, recognizing the changed environment and what are the coping strategies which we need to put in place to deal with this.
So, just to pick up on one point, and I'll get back to Zorawar on the larger question. Do you think our sort of these the recent steps towards ensuring that Indian officials do not participate in the Tibetan anniversary of the Dalai Lama's exile and so on constitute that kind of an approach of trying not to annoy the Chinese because but then of course since then in practice that decision was reversed. So is there a policy or is it?
I'm unable to really answer that question because I don't know what has been. But let me say this. Let me say this. That over the last several years, there have been standing instructions that we maintain the position that we have consistently taken that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a revered religious figure. That we as an open democratic society, he is a welcome guest. So are the Tibetan, the Tibetan community here. But we do not associate with whatever the political sort of claims of the Tibetan community may be, and in that context, that Indian officials should not associate themselves with activities which may compromise the stand which we have taken. So these have been instructions which have been there for quite some time. Doesn't mean that, for example, if the Dalai Lama goes to Arunachal Pradesh, he's provided security, he's provided all protocol assistance, but nobody from the government would be associated with that. So it's not that visits to Arunachal by His Holiness has not taken place before. Yeah. So in 2009 also, I remember he went to Arunachal, but we did not. We took the precaution of not associating, state agencies with that. There may have been some exceptions here and there. I'm not sure, but I'm certain as Foreign Secretary, I was certainly very clear that these instructions were very much there. What has happened, I think, in the last 4 years is that for whatever reason, there have been departures from this SOP. So if you are going back to these SOPs, I cannot fault the government for doing that. Why should you make these kind of departures? For what purpose? But having made that and having to come back to it, there is a certain cost, perceptual cost that you are paying. And I don't think it is fair to His Holiness and to the Tibetan community.
No, and I mean, in fact, the Prime Minister of the government in exile, Lobsang Sangye, was invited for the Prime Minister's swearing-in ceremony at that point of time. A very strong message was sent out up front that we are not going to be mindful of these.
So I don't see. I mean, I don't. There is no Tibet card. I mean, if you ask me, and therefore I think we should maintain the position. Which is, I think, eminently sensible position to maintain, that we have welcomed His Holiness to India as a very revered religious personage, that we do not permit political activities by the Tibetan community here in India. But as long as they are law-abiding residents of India, there is they are free to engage in whatever activities they do. So this has to be handled carefully because of the fact that it is a sensitive issue as far as China is concerned. Don't forget that when the Olympics were taking place in Beijing, the Chinese government thanked the government of India for not allowing
In fact, the protests happened not very far from
exactly.
right now.
Exactly.
So, Zorawar, let me come back to you about the bigger question which Ambassador Saran was talking about, which is that, he clearly believes that you cannot go back to the older sort of principles on which a modest vivendi was reached. He believes that given the disparity between the power of India and China in an aggregate national power sense, the safest option for India is to link up with other like-minded powers. In a way, we are seeing some of that stuff happening with Japan, Australia, United States, of course, in a bit to sort of at least impose certain constraints on Chinese behavior, ensure that they are not unilaterally able to sort of bring in new norms and principles, whether it's in the maritime domain or other areas and so on. But do you share that kind of the overall sort of
Sure.
pessimism that that this stuff is not likely to happen?
Sure. So I think that's a great point. That how do you handle a relationship where you have an obvious glaring material asymmetry? So a classic approach is the balance of power strategy, where weaker states have always sought to exercise it. India has done it in the past as well. I think if you look back even in the late Nehru period, you see a clear sort of motivation to tap both the superpowers with certainly economic factors, but also China very much at the center of that. But what was the lesson of that particular 62 crisis? That you you had the best of relationships with Moscow and Washington from 59 to 62. In fact, the Indian side believed it had the upper hand, and yet it was not a deterrent to Chinese behavior. So I would argue that you need to have both legs on this to be stronger. But now I'll come back to more specific points that when you're looking at which you absolutely must do and you have been doing, that is deepen your ties with China's neighbors and its other rivals who might sort of at least offset some of the burden of shaping this new Asian balance of power. But when you get into the specificities of this process, I look at South Asia first and then I come to wider East Asia. So when you look at South Asia, I mean, you just have to dispassionately look at US-China relations as far as it's played out in the subcontinent. I see them still having fairly shared interests on the basic conceptions of what a regional order will be. Pakistan is very much part of that order, a balance of power and strategic stability. And I don't think
between India and Pakistan.
yes,
Yeah.
And I don't think either side believes that Indian hegemony or preponderance is to either side's advantage. So you look at it in Afghanistan. There are a lot of areas where when you move from the abstract to ground level, you find that some of your partners might not be able to fulfill their side of the picture. So how do you leverage that? So maybe a more efficient way of leveraging that is build up your capacity constraints in certain areas where there are shortfalls. The second factor that will complicate the operationalization of a balance of power strategy doesn't mean that you stop pursuing it, is the very deep economic interdependence and security interdependence between China and the United States and China and Japan and most of East Asia. And those are precisely the partners that you are wanting to invite to counterbalance Chinese influence. So of course it's going to work, but there are going to be limits in that process. There are going to be limits in Japanese politics, there are going to be limits in the US corporate sector, there are going to be limits if we see what the Korean Peninsula is going to be playing out very shortly, a transformed Northeast Asian security environment where the US and China might just be shared benefactors of stabilizing that area. So, I would sort of I like more the internal balancing effort, obviously relying on these bigger powers, but where are the capacity constraints within? So I think that's where the debate ought to be going, rather than militarizing or excessively over securitizing your foreign policy. For and now sort of this is my when I look at Chinese power in South Asia and this BRI and various other projections of Chinese influence, and I don't think this is a controversial point. I don't think the military factor is the number one factor, the way the Chinese are projecting their power. Where are they projecting their power? Through political economy, through infrastructure, through financial capabilities, through its institutional strength. So if those are the areas that it's coming in, why are you focusing so much on the military side? So there's a mismatch of the counterbalancing options that you are visualizing with the US Navy militarizing the Quad. That's going to do nothing to offset Chinese economic investments into South Asia or its political economic linkages with your neighborhood. They need the money, they need infrastructure, they need capacity, they need financial support. So yes, Japan certainly comes into that picture, but you don't want to open up the region into some sort of like where you just lose control of that process. So the worst outcome would be that you invite a whole range of external powers into the subcontinent to offset what you perceive as a Chinese intrusion, which is acting in very specific areas and at the end of the day, your influence is even diminished even further, which is what is going to play out if you don't shape the norms that all actors ought to be abiding by when they are playing this great game or this balance of power game. So I find balance of power as a solid concept, but when you break it down, I think that's where we need to spend a lot more time, maybe internally thinking about where we need to be leveraging and which of our partners are most capable in offering that support.
Also, if I may just add a corollary to what you said, which is that, maybe we should also think hard about segregating what you might call as real hard interests and other kind of status quos, right? I mean, at some level, you could argue that a seat on the National Nuclear Suppliers Group is a status quo, right? Whether you sort of get Chinese support on getting someone blacklisted or not is not going to materially change the situation of terrorism for you, right? So, do you think we should have to sort of make some of those hard choices, bite the bullet and say, listen, this is the reality of power, we'll try and do what we can?
I think, frankly, there's a consensus that most of those issues, like NSG, were not really the ones that you stake out. I think Ambassador Saran's also spoken about it earlier, that those were not the case. You sort of made this deep stand that this is how we're going to measure Chinese friendship or stability. That was the wrong way to go about it. You should be focusing on the core areas which truly, maybe in the region, maybe CPEC, maybe your frontiers, and that's the way to have sort of brought some sort of stability onto it. But you went into a sort of a high-profile publicity stunt to showcase you will become a rule player in some of these institutions, which didn't make sense. I mean, you're right, they're peripheral to the goals that you ought to have set for yourself. So,
just wanted to bring you into the conversation on Korea and so on, because clearly at this point of time, I think from the Chinese perspective, and maybe this is one reason why the Chinese also want to keep the relationship with India on an even keel, is because I think from a security sort of angle, the Korean Peninsula situation seems to be right on top of their minds. The second is the sort of completely sort of rapidly deteriorating economic relationship between US and China, which of course will have knock-on effects in terms of the sort of wider global regional trading system and for countries like India as well. And you have always maintained that if you want to understand how China will behave towards India, we have to understand where India fits into the larger worldview of China. So where do you think we fit in at this point of time, and what is the larger sort of challenge there?
Just to perhaps bring in somewhat different perspective on what Sora was said. It is not my case that we should have a sort of excessively militaristic kind of relationship with other major powers. Certainly not. The military aspect will certainly be a very important component, but I think there are enough independent reasons why India should have a strong relationship with the United States of America, with Japan, for example. It also assists in dealing with the asymmetry that we are talking about. So if we want to build up our economic capabilities, if we want to have a larger economic profile, trade profile, having those kind of strong relationships with the United States, with Japan, can be very helpful to us. Don't forget that we were able to, use that overall strategic convergence with the United States to get, say, the nuclear deal. Today, nobody is talking about a nuclear fuel problem for India. In 2005, this was the big challenge that, Tarapur is going to close down because we just simply don't have access to fuel. Today, you have something like 15 or 16 long-term uranium supply agreements with a host of countries. So, essentially, what I'm trying to say is that your diplomacy must be of a kind that is able to multiply your options.
So, in a sense, also internal balancing is linked.
Multiplying options is not just military. Multiplying options is, today we live in a world where the sources of power are not maybe just military. Sources of power are multiple in terms of technology, in terms of economy, in terms of military, yes, and even if you look at it in a larger sense, even governance. So we are in a much more complex environment, and therefore our game has to be also much more complex, has to be much more nuanced. I certainly do not think that if there is a confrontation with China tomorrow at the border, that the American Marines will come and help us, or the Japanese will send their ships to help us. No, but having those kind of diversified relationships with other major powers, as I said, constrains the options that China has and expands our own options, and that's as far as I want to go. Now, as far as the Korean Peninsula situation is concerned, it is fraught because this is one area where you have the intersecting interests of six powers. You have the United States, you have China, you have Russia, you have Japan, and of course the two Koreas. So from that point of view, it is a very complex situation. Now, I think what has happened in the recent past is that with respect to the North Korea nuclear issue and the escalation that we have seen, both Koreas, for different reasons, have decided that maybe it is better in terms of our respective interests to lead the détente between us rather than by the rest. Because for North Korea, I think it has been a alarm that China has actually been ready to turn the screws on them, hoping to get some benefit from the United States of America or even from Japan. Now, China, of course, has multiple objectives. To just give you a small example, mention was made of the Quad. China does not like the Quad. So, what does China do? As it did, in the earlier incarnation of the Quad. The sort of drive momentum towards building up the Quad into something more than what currently it is. It is not very much at the moment. China has very effectively been able to put across that in order to deal with the threat which Japan, for example, faces from North Korea or the US faces, it is China which can actually help in resolving the situation. This message is very, very clearly sort of received by the Japanese, who, when they come to India, before that, Abe makes a statement welcoming, in fact, the OBOR after having expressed great skepticism. But he says, of course, it must be transparent and it must be, according to various norms. But the headline is Japan is ready to work together with China on the OBOR. So what do the Chinese do? Then they come to us and say, see, even your friends, the Japanese, are ready to do this. Why do the Japanese then mute their participation in the Quad? Because otherwise China may not be as helpful on Korea as you. So there is a game being played there, but a game which also then affects North Korea, which is then reacting to this. In terms of South Korea or Japan, it has been clear for some time that the credibility of American security assurances to these countries has been diminished. I mean, there is no sense like in the past that the threat to these allies will actually trigger an American response. So you just take one example. Trump says, if you get a missile which is going to hit our mainland, then I will not let you go that far. What about the threat which is already posed to the Japanese and the Koreans now? So under the alliance, is this not a serious enough threat? So here the message is, when I am going to be threatened, I will act. But as far as you are concerned, maybe not.
Extended clearances.
Exactly. So I think it is this dynamic which in a sense has led the two Koreas to make the independent moves that they have. And now you have the others trying to catch up. I mean, China is obviously trying to catch. They don't like this young man, in Pyongyang. He has bumped off several of the people who were Chinese, very close to China. So the fact that they have taken this step of actually inviting him to Beijing is actually an admission of, this gambit did not work to China's advantage, and China needs to catch up. Otherwise, somebody else will get into the game. So this is on one hand, it is very encouraging, because it has obviously diffused the situation dramatically. What happens now is a bit of a question. How, for example, will the forthcoming summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, given their kind of volatile personalities, how that will work out? And do we end up in a more dangerous situation than we have, where both China and the US not wanting to be left out and a sense of alarm at being marginalized, may do things which will not be in conducive to this particular peace process being carried forward. And this, of course, will have an impact on you.
Any quick thoughts on the economic side of, are we sort of looking at the barrel of a full-fledged trade war between the United States and China? Because it seems that the Chinese they've taken a calibrated response. They didn't want to sort of go overboard at this point of time. But clearly, this is going to be a major, given that was one major arena of common interest between the United States and China. Do you think it's going to make the situation of security competition worse, or is it going to mitigate?
So it's quite interesting. We used to think that economic interdependence would mute security problems, but now you're seeing economic proximity creating its own set of issues. So what I'm seeing in the United States is we're getting a mixed picture. So how far can we project this escalating? I find it difficult to sort of going down that, because the costs to American business will be so severe, and the Chinese have sort of laid out that they're not interested in that trade war, but the reciprocal measures that they might take would make it too formidable. So, and I also see, of course, the domestic politics within the United States for the Trump regime to demonstrate they're doing something to sort of salvage manufacturing jobs, or at least bring some back, or preserve a little more. So they're straddling these two games. I'm not too sure of, is it purely domestic politics, or are they truly bargaining with China from a holistic standpoint of rebalancing the economic relationship? And because on the security side, you're certainly seeing US and China tacitly collaborate on the Korean Peninsula. There's no doubt it's happening. I mean, and in some sense, I would look at it as from, let's say, another part of Asia, is that you're seeing the leading power of the Pacific, that is the United States, adjust to the balance of power. I think a settlement of the Korean Peninsula, whatever shape it takes, which ultimately neutralizes the Korean Peninsula, that is, creates some sort of a non-aligned area, or at least an area that is open to both sides, would be a recognition of the United States that it is now retreating to maritime Asia and leaving the continent more to the Chinese in the future. Because, and why is that coming? Because South Koreans themselves, in fact, if you look at the economic interdependence between China and South Korea, out of all its neighbors, China's, the South Korean-China relationship on the economy surpassed what the Koreans had with the Americans, I think, over 10, 12 years ago. So that tipping point is now sort of reflecting in choices made in Seoul as well.
The Trump administration has spoken out quite clearly. The FTA between US and South Korea is one of the things they want to revisit, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
there's
So
a
that
lot of
further
pressure.
sort of pushes them in that direction. Yeah.